Okay, so we're now live on YouTube, so I think we'll make a start. So I'd just like to start by welcoming everybody to this. This is we're Friday, the 12th of June. This is Around the World in 8 Hours with Sir Peter Cook series. Today and this evening in London, it's 6 p.m. and that's 1 p.m. in New York. We're absolutely delighted to have Elizabeth Diller, who's a distinguished professor, visiting professor at the Bartlett, and Peter will introduce her very shortly. We had Sue Fujimoto this morning, and this series evolved out of talks that Peter was doing for our first years at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And during the lockdown, he reached out and asked for it to go online. And following that, our director of school, Professor Bob Scheel and Barbara Campbell-Lang, asked whether or not we could upgrade this into a sort of series of global chats. So here we are, and we're very delighted to have you. I'll hand you to Peter now.
Well, it's really almost difficult to know whether one should do any introductory material at all, because you're so talked about, and you know, I think your major projects are probably familiar to nearly everybody watching. On the other hand, I want it to be more of a sort of review. I'm intrigued to do a loop, which I do from my own meeting you 30 whatever number of years ago it was. And I find myself repeating myself from two weeks ago when I was talking to Neil Denari, because I said to Neil, you know, I remember the first time I met you was at the storefront, and I think Leb Woods was the person who introduced us. And it was on that same visit, still in storefront, that you and Rick came, and I think just a little tiny slide projector, and showed some stuff. And you were, and so that's why Leb is appearing.
Yes, I was wondering. He's overseeing
us that it was he who introduced us. And I like this photo of you and Rick from maybe that period. You were sort of a couple of Cooper types, very much, I think, and you were rather conspiratorial. But also, I think from early days, or fairly early days, the project that really intrigued and still intrigues is the Slow House. And I feel that it contained, it was like before you'd really started building things, you'd done some installations maybe, that it contained all your thinking sort of compressed into one house, which I seem to remember the story might have even happened. And so I continue with the Slow House, and some of the drawings obtained in the Slow House, and also to some of your illustrations, remind me of conversations that were perhaps coming out of our friend Mike Webb's connection. I seem to also remember that Mike and Rick taught together on and off at
Cooper
period. Yeah. And so there's this sort of loop. And other odd occasions when we were inveigled out to Oneonta by Leb, and we all sat in a shed saying things that we would never say in front of students, etc. So I have a nostalgia for that, and my God, how you come on and say. But I think I'm intrigued by you in particular as almost a kind of Renaissance woman, or maybe you and Rick as Renaissance people, that yes, you do buildings that aren't quite buildings, you're still doing installations, and you're making opera, and you're choreographing. And I remember the very first lecture I think I saw you, I think I hosted it in Frankfurt in the Stadelschule, where you stood behind the lectern and did this very controlled staccato, sort of almost robotic, but beautifully robotic way of presenting. And Rick, with a gloved hand which picked up the light, described the arcs. And that was, that was in a sense an installation piece, but I don't think I'd ever heard any architects do stuff like that. And then jumping time, the Blur, which sadly, I never actually got to see it in the flesh, but as a phenomenon, it was fantastic, because how many conversations have there been about the dissolve of the building? The building is there, but it dissolves, it's not there. And this morning with Fujimoto, Sue, we were talking about his notion of the edges of, for example, his Serpentine Pavilion ending like a cloud. And I said, well, this evening we're going to be coming back also to the notion of the dissolve and the cloud, which has been a dream, I think, of many of us, but you did it. Okay, there's a lot of gadgetry behind the cloud, but there's the cloud. Now, I paired these two illustrations for a funny reason. Treating the building or the architectural occurrence as a kind of device. In fact, this was an old, in Bartlett circles a few years ago, the term device was used a great deal. But it occurred to me that if you're sitting in the ICA in Boston, the mouth opens and there is the water. And shit, you've done the same thing on the High Line. The great moment, certainly the early part of the High Line, is where you sit and the mouth opens and there is the traffic. And I thought, yes, this is a piece of sheer choreography. Okay, one is then in carcass by a building, if you like, and the other is part of a kind of linear choreography, but it's there. And to carry this on, therefore, that I feel that in your perhaps greatest installation of all, which is the High Line, you extend, and I know you're going to be showing pieces of this mile-long opera, and I think that's fantastic. You're not content with just positioning or even choreographing the normal day-to-day use of it, but then you want to extend it. You want to choreograph it further, find other dimensions, if that is singing and atmosphere, nighttime, and so on. And this is going on in your installation. The Broad or Broad, which I find they call it in LA, was the first time that Jan and I'd seen you in giant scale. And again, I come into favorite moments. My favorite moment in the Broad is actually when you can come back down and see the storage part. You're given this tantalizing glimpse. That's why I'm showing the section where you pass back, though not on the escalator, but you pass back down the stair, and you can see the stuff that normally, having also designed an art museum, you hide that. Most of us hide it somewhere behind, but you don't. You say, no, Mr. Broad, or whoever he is, has this great collection of stuff, and you see it, now you don't. That is, again, sheer choreography, I think. And so I'm then to the shed, which again is a conversation, the notion of the moving building, the building that metamorphoses into something else. And so you bring together, you know, kind of a walking city in Cedric Price's Fun Palace, but you do it. And I just see in your presentation, you have this picture, which I'd not seen you show before, of the box, of the sliding open box. But it's also choreography. And that fascinates me, that there's still this, as I say, Renaissance extension beyond, you know, so many architects who just do architecture, and they're very pleased about that. But I think you're not content. You probably never have been. That's all I want to say at this point.
Well, that's a beautiful introduction, Peter. Thank you. You know, I really, these days we only see each other when we do formal events. So I grab any chance, you know, that at an invitation, have a chat with you. So, but in this context of reflection about our work and sort of the mental connections that you're making, very interesting, you know, and especially when we're all pent up, you know, in our houses and apartments, you know, to reflect on a lot of things. You know, some of this work that you showed, I want to just respond maybe with a couple of thoughts, and then go on to a short presentation of what I'm thinking about. So the slow house, what you first showed was maybe a breakthrough project for us. It was around 1990, 1989 or so when we started it. And it was the first time after maybe a decade of doing independently generated projects where we said, well, maybe it's possible to do architecture in a more conventional way, that is with a client. It's maybe possible to execute an idea for a building. Before that, we were very cynical about it. After architecture school, I thought that the profession was intellectually bankrupt, and there was just no space to think and to experiment. And one could do that on paper, and one could do that in an academic context, but to actually do something in physical space, we had to sort of grab the space, steal it, you know, and that was in the form of installations. But the Slow House was the first opportunity that we had to sort of to make an idea, to make it happen physically in space. And there was, you know, unfortunately, it was not completed. It was, it went as far as a foundation was entirely designed. And those images that you show, the drawings and the models and the experiments and representation, I felt were, some of them came before the house was started construction, a lot of them, and some came after. And, you know, I really thought that that project made me realize all the different manifestations of an architectural project. It's not only that drawings lead up to a physical manifestation of physical work, but the drawings and the models and the stories are all manifestations of a work. And even if a work doesn't get executed, it is executed in these various forms. And I remember also that as a breakthrough project, it won all sorts of awards. It was published even before it started getting built. And it was on the cover of Progressive Architecture, which is a leading professional architecture magazine in the US. And I remember Peter Eisenman telling me that I sold out by being on the cover of an architectural magazine. And I thought that that was, you know, a very, very interesting comment that said more about Peter than Rick and myself in the studio. You know, we really never thought about it as, you know, as selling out. We just thought about it as sort of engaging slowly in a discipline and a profession that eased its way for us to enter. You know, and perhaps we could talk about like what all of that was. But these various projects that you showed have a lot in common. There are certain agendas that we've always had that have been part of our work. And you could see this interest in visuality, that is the culture of vision. So it goes beyond optics, and it includes all sorts of social issues around vision, which has to do with control and has to do with, you know, surveillance and you know, and wanting to show off in front of the public. And so there are all sorts of manifestations of seeing, and it extends into our work to, you know, something as small as an installation or a display in a museum space, and the relationship between a spectator and a thing, you know, and that very, very sort of thin space in between. What I wanted to do maybe is, we can come back to any of those projects, but maybe just show this constellation of projects that are in one spot, that were in one spot. And it demonstrates a certain kind of, Christine, maybe you can just cue up the presentation. And a certain kind of, you know, Peter says that we just don't stop, you know, we keep sort of, the project is never over, it keeps going, and there's a certain kind of, you know, I would say restlessness that we have in terms of exploring ideas, and it's all a part of research, no matter what form it takes. But there's also a kind of self-awareness about the work in and of itself and how it relates to everything around it. And that continually changes. So work that we've done before, when we look at it now, might trigger a new reaction. And we think about that as the post-occupancy time. But it's something that is maybe constant. And it made me, I started to realize that when you do work in cities and when you tamper with cities, you're usually in some kind of, you agree to come into some kind of life cycle of a city. You know, sometimes when it's on its way up, when it's growing and taking, becoming something new, or when it's on its way down, when it's dying. You know, maybe you help it come to life, or maybe you help it die. But you just are there, and it's not necessarily that you will it to be. And sometimes your work is part of that, and you don't really even understand it when it's happening. I wanted to look at this particular spot. It's where our studio actually is. It includes the High Line and the Shed, and I wanted to just talk about that. Even though this is work that's done, we're constantly reflecting on it. So next slide. And so the High Line here goes, we're seeing it at the very, very northern end around the Hudson Yards development, which is 50% done on the east side, on the right. And then the rest of it will come into fruition, I guess, in the next decade or decades. The High Line wraps around that space and proceeds south. That's to the left of the screen. And along the way, there's the Shed, and there's also a tower, a residential tower that we ended up doing, we didn't really expect to do. And these are, let's say, the High Line, the residential project, and the Shed are three independent projects, three independent clients, and opportunities, and done it really 3 times. And then there's also a project on the High Line that I wanted to show you, Marlon Opera. So these 4 concentrated projects are very related to one another. And again, it's something that we didn't really understand as we were doing them. So next. Christine, can you go to 4?
Yeah, it should be on the High Line slide.
Okay, but can you do it full screen?
Sorry, 1 second.
If you do the play, and then just, okay, that's it. Okay, so and we're going to go through this very, very quickly. Okay, so the High Line, many of you probably know, is an obsolete piece of urban infrastructure on the west side of Manhattan for the distribution of stuff like meats and other products into warehouses and light industry. Next. There's a real delay here. Okay, and the site before was pretty desolate. It was actually, it had a lot of character. It was kind of messy and dirty, but it was fairly vacant as well. And a lot of prostitution, a lot of sex trade, a lot of, there are some still meat packing areas, but a lot of it was going bust, and a lot of desolation and open seas of parking lots. Next. And when the High Line, there's conversation about making the High Line into potentially a park, which was not our idea. We just stepped into a phase of a competition that we were very fortunate to win based on an idea that we put forward. But there was already an argument by the real estate developers in that area that saw the High Line as an eyesore that actually devalued their properties. So the idea of turning the High Line into something was, thought to be a very bad idea. And there was literature such as this distributed all over. So it was not a very popular thing to do. Next. So the High Line was, in a way, argued And I would say I'm just rounding this argument out a little bit, but from my perspective, where we have Olmsted on the left and Central Park, the argument was the growth to the north of Manhattan and how important a public park would be to the urban development and economic development of a city. And then you look at the right and you see how the area has all been built out. And this is a great example of how a park makes a difference. This was the argument that was also used on the High Line, that area that was just so devastated and empty could actually become very lively and different kinds of activities happening next. Okay, the High Line was executed in various phases. It's never finished. It's always like just half a step away from being totally completed, but very much used next. And just flip through the next slides, Christine, very quickly. Okay, well, not that quickly. I mean, just one at a time. Okay, well, anyway, I think most of you know the High Line. So, leave it to say that the High Line at once was thought to be, just a kind of worthless pursuit to becoming one of the highest New York attractions, one of the most important New York attractions. You could see something like when we initially thought maybe 400,000 people would visit a year. That was the projection to something like, actually it was over 8 million last year. Next. Okay, and then there are so many High Lines. It triggered, and we're very, very proud of this. And we can't keep up with it. Sometimes we record how many High Line types of inspired projects there are all over the world. And we think of this as having touched a nerve on the good side, touched a nerve around thinking about obsolescence and the importance of rethinking our obsolete structures, and at a time of limited resources on our planet, why not repurpose even kind of the strangest relationships of repurposing, and at the same time, in our digital world where we're all collapsed into 2D, especially now, haven't seen a 3D person for a long time. But in that world, the notion of being public and being in public space is something that people still value, and we could see it now, and everyone's trying to escape from their homes and maybe unnecessarily risking their lives. Next. Okay, and then the High Line became much more popular than we had imagined, almost too popular, where there are days of the year where the weather's nice and it's Sunday where it gets very, very crowded and super unpleasant. Next. And Christine, if you maybe keep going on the button, I'll just try to keep up with you because there's a very big delay that we're getting. So the High Line was, also economically, it was, something that that had another kind of unexpected effect. Beyond being so popular, it actually drew the prices of real estate up. And here in this New York magazine article, you could see everything that we love and hate about New York. So this sort of golden, this gold brick, that's actually real estate all around the High Line. Keep going. The Wall Street Journal, the High Line's halo effect on property. So the High Line started to get built up. That sea of parking lots started to get all filled up. And here you could see this, this isn't complete. This was done at a certain point in time. How much real estate had already changed in this area, and especially going north to Hudson Yards and around, and the whole far west side, which is going to continue to grow. And it's not that High Line was responsible for it. There was definitely part this growth and the popularity toward this west side of Manhattan, which was really forsaken. Next. Okay, so at the very north leg of the High Line was a site that you can see the shed. That location is Hudson Yards redevelopment, and keep going, and I'll just sort of keep up with you. There was a request for proposals from the city of New York for anyone that wanted to do something on the High Line, that had an idea for it. This came in 2008, when in the middle of the economic collapse, and really no cultural institution had any ideas. And we came forward, with our friend David Rockwell, who we made a proposal to the city to do a cultural facility there that was unlike any other one in New York. Keep going, just keep spinning, and I'll keep up with you. Okay, so we said that there are so many cultural institutions already in New York. Well, why should there be one? Another one. Well, there isn't one that's multidisciplinary, but actually is flexible. And I want to just underline, not generic. That could sort of live at different scales. It could be indoors and outdoors, and has that kind of flexibility. Next. And this, so I just want to back up just one moment to say that when we think about culture in the future, the only thing that we could say safely about predicting what it is that we don't know what it's going to be. And so the notion of flexibility was extremely important, but what does really flexibility really mean? And this project really came to define for us what it could mean, and Fun Palace was definitely one of the very few examples that we could refer to of something that was built for a future that could not be understood. So the idea was to use the footprint that was already assigned to the project, and also consider the footprint next to it, which ultimately the city controlled, initially not. But our idea was to use our footprint for a stack of column-free spaces, very large column-free spaces that were very, very flexible, and have a shell that would nest on top of that volume and could roll out to protect the space to the east and effectively double its footprint. This was the first little model that we made. 1, 2, and keep going. Okay, there's I don't know, something sticky in there. Should open. So the technology is based on an industrial technology that comes from the shipping yards, and it's just applied to something the scale of a building. And here you can see the section at the bottom on the right. And here there are really two structural methods. One is a conventional steel frame structure. The other one is a very sort of idiosyncratic exposed steel frame. And yeah, let it just play. With ETFE pillows that are the thermal protection. That give the thermal protection of insulated glass, but at 1/100th the weight. Now here, this animation is playing very choppy because it's online, but this is, if you go to our website, you can see this very smooth, and this was a little animation that we showed to basically get people excited about this project. So long story short, we submitted it. The city thought it was a good idea, but for the first 3 years, we were on our own, developing this and proving it out. And then slowly we started to get, the city was always there. The city was always kind of behind it, but we were still, it wasn't a real project for quite a long time as we were engineering it and thinking it through. So one of the ideas here that you can see that very top of the shed itself is occupiable, and you can see people walking around there. this allows the ceiling to be a theatrical ceiling where you can fly anything in and out of it. Very flexible. You can control the light and sound, and you can show films. You could have theatrical performances and concerts, and you could make the space feel smaller or larger. And anyway, this, oops, okay, I'll keep going. And so these guillotine doors come way up and open effectively to the inside, to expand the footprint inside, and also to the outside, to make a kind of indoor-outdoor environment. And then we're going to go up to the ceiling. What's very interesting about this project, clearly it was executed, and see a couple of images from it. But what was very interesting is when we started to think about all the different, designing for a future that we could never predict, we realized, now how this project could come into its full use. So Alex Poots, the artistic director, is exploring ways to actually produce this indoor-outdoor environment, this crossover environment, for the next, near future that we see before the pandemic is really behind us, and to still be able to conduct cultural programming in the shed. So keep going. Oh, this is such a delay. Okay, and I would appreciate, Christine, just hit the button, but one at a time, because sometimes it takes many pictures at the same time. So just one at a time. Okay, in construction, and here we have the shed almost completed. Next, and just keep going. This little video just shows the shed as we were actually commissioning the movement, and it actually is very smooth and very, very silent when it moves, and quite magical. So the shed, the opportunities for indoor-outdoor spaces have not been exploited entirely yet. We've had activities on the exterior, lots of activities on the interior, and now we're going to test, all the different aspects of it. This is the motors are on the top, and basically it's to move this whole building, it takes the horsepower of one Prius engine. So only about 170 horsepower to move it. Okay, let's keep going, because I want to leave as much time for conversation as possible. This is what drives it. Push button. Next. Okay, some food trucks driving in. Okay, so some of the programming, and this is at the opening. We had, great. Just go back one step for a moment. So the soundtrack of America. So this is April 5. That's the opening day, and this was really a monumental historical moment. So we have a program, 5-day program that was curated by Quincy Jones and Steve McQueen, and an African-American historian, Maureen Mahan. And this was 5 concerts that each concert was a sort of coming out of many African-American artists. And this is all about the celebration of African-American music historically. And every young artist, it was all devoted to young artists that were unknown. And basically, they had to define their lineage, who they were inspired by, and then defining the lineage of their inspiration, who they were inspired by. And so it created this kind of family tree. Next. Okay, these are the basically, and this is a little bit, the family tree got put into a square poster, but it's really very fascinating. Next. And this is one of the concerts. You can see this was for standing room, and we also take a little portion of space inside of the galleries. It's before some of the talent, from tap dancers to marching bands to military groups to folk singers to reggae bands. I was just all over the place. Next. And then also much more blue chip artists. And here you could just go through that. People can just read. Ben Wishon, Renee Fleming, and York had a great, huge spectacle. And Dragon Springs got family programming, a kung fu musical, and then much more programming in terms of street dancing and many other things, in the galleries. Next. This is Flexing, and a play by Claudia Rankin about white men that she met in transit at 35,000 feet. And then Open Call, where artists, local artists are invited to submit projects that are, a bunch are selected every year, every 2 years that are supported by the Shed, and that will be revealed at the Shed. And this is just a little bit of a timeline to show you what was going on. On the left, you see like around 2004, 2005, the city sets out on this idea of doing something on this site. And then when our team started in 2008, we won this RFP, and we started, but there was no institution really that was behind it. The institution didn't exist. It was just a bunch of architects and engineers. And the program was sort of, invented, and we had a support, Kate Levin of the City of Cultural, Commission of Cultural Affairs, and Dan Doctoroff, that was then at Bloomberg, who was before that the deputy mayor. And they were out there. They weren't necessarily with us directly, but they were out there, and the project kept going. But we were relatively on our own, developing the ideas and having to prove them out. The Shed becomes an institution in like 2012, 2013. We have our first contract, actually. And then in 2014, Alex Poots, the brilliant CEO and artistic director of the Shed, is hired. And the match was made in heaven, because the alignment of his vision of programming and post-programming and inventing new ways of blending so-called high and pop culture, or flattening those distinctions, and really bringing people together that would never imagine to be together, not only artists, but also audiences. And his fabulous group and hired up about 100 people to make the Shed a thing. So just in closing on this part, I just want to show one more piece. Keep going. So here's the Shed, and then so here's some of the. There's a lot of stuff to read around the Shed when it opened. So this one, the Washington Post. The Shed is the only reason to go to Hudson Yards. Here from the New York Times, and a playground for the 1%, an art center for the rest of us. And these are positive reflections on the Shed, but in a very, very negative reception of Hudson Yards. And then there's this other kind of stuff that also had come out about the Highline effect, which, in many ways was a very positive thing. But, how New York's glitziest park spread extreme inequality. And so all of this, when I said that sometimes inadvertently one is caught inside of a history that you don't really understand the arc of, and you want to do good, but you just don't know how good, and you can't really control it. So what we wanted to do here with the Mile Long Opera was have a reflection on our own sort of part in this history, and actually do something more, so do the next thing. And it was a reflection on the past and future, well, which is better? They're both kind of okay, and they're both, one could be critical as well of both. Next. So the biography of 7 o'clock is its subtitle. Keep going. And quickly. The singers, 1,000 of them are spread out across an entire mile and a half of the High Line, and the audience wanders in between. And these are our collaborators. We have David Lang, who is the composer. Sorry, I'm losing my words. A brilliant composer and co-creator with me and Claudia Rankin and Carson, two great poets who wrote the lyrics for this. And Lindsay Peisinger co-directed. And we have a fantastic music director. The idea here was that little subtitle, A Biography of 7 o'clock, was really key, because this whole project was a reflection about gentrification in a way, and was a reflection on the speed of change of our cities, mostly post-industrial cities that immediately become something else. And what is and if you go back to that slide for a second, so our association with 7 o'clock is this time when dad comes home from work, and at least in my generation, and mom puts a meal on the table for the whole family. And it's certainly not the experience of the modern family, but actually the contemporary family is maybe not entirely a family at all. Maybe very often of single parents, parents that work at different shifts. And it's a very, very different thing to different cultures. Now keep going with the next slides very quickly. Okay, so 7 o'clock means something else. We sent a photographer out to photograph 7 o'clock and to show you a couple of stills. The project itself. Now, maybe you can just go through these quickly, and I'd like to maybe just play a little bit of the music if we can hear it. And Christine, just keep hitting the button and pushing it forward. So this is at the entrance, and basically it's the audience enters at one end, at the southern end of the High Line, and weaves through the singers a mile and a half to the northern end at their own speed. Christine, are you having a hard time moving it?
No, I'm at the standard now, but I can go back.
Oh, you're at this should be the first slide of the picture. Oh, you're at the end. Okay, I don't know what happened. Okay, there were a series of slides of, maybe, can you play some of, can you just show some of those slides? Because there should be about 10 of them. There's something weird happening, and maybe it's just my reception here. Okay, and anyway, there are 1,000 singers, and the audience is able to weave between and be very, very close to the singers. And yeah, this is it. Okay. Now, maybe it's the speed in which you're driving it that just advances to the end. Just do a couple of these, you'll be fine. Anyway, the lyrics came out of interviews with actual New Yorkers and their own experiences. This chorus was made up of about 44 choirs from all over New York, church choirs, community choirs, lots of non-professional singers. Maybe 250 of the 1,000 were professional singers. And it was a beautifully diverse mix of New Yorkers singing these very, very beautiful and quite solemn and sometimes very funny lyrics about their own experiences in New York. This is from the interviews. Maybe we could, and we took advantage of some of the acoustic spaces that produce booming sound. There are spaces of dissipated sound. There are spaces across intersections and next to helipads. Next to the highway where the singers were drowned out. But it was a very, very evocative 7 days of performance in New York. And I have to say that this was the first time that we've ever co-created, co-directed, and co-produced. Also, the Highline helped a bit, but we raised all the money and produced this work ourselves, and it was an amazingly well received. Can you play a little bit of it in the background? Oh yeah, and we also did installations along the way into various interiors. You know what? I think that maybe we can't hear on Zoom, on videos. Is that, do the techies in the crowd know how we can get sound?
Hear, we can see it fine.
Oh yes.
Just before night.
Civil twilight, the sun, 6 degrees below the horizon.
Grocery store around here anymore. No place to get your shoes. The river to the clock, foam the dust, or the bleach, towel the river. Want what they want, but they want you not to have it. Punch, rooks, sharks, rush hour. The thing about the city. There's a level of anger.
Okay, I think we can stop. Okay, I think we can cut it. Just to get a little conversation with Peter in there before we have to stop. But this, you know, I wanted to, the reason why I wanted to show this cluster of projects is to really, you know, talk about a kind of self-awareness in the work, that here there's a succession of projects that are that really were not done together, but one affected the other. The Highline produced an effect of urban development, not all of which was great, but it produced an opportunity for the shed to happen. Without it, probably the shed would have never happened. The opportunity to do the shed and to initiate a project in a very unusual sort of financial crisis, and to be on both sides of the table, on the client side of the table and the architects, was truly an unusual opportunity. And then, you know, as we saw the site progress and the changes and transformations, it made us want to do something and actually use the site where it happened, the Highline, that generated a lot of this growth and development, to actually have a self-reflection on that, using the space and the city as a backdrop and also as a protagonist of the piece. And so this, that's another loop, Peter, that when you mentioned a loop, this, you know, our work, which takes the form of buildings, parks, and performance and installation projects, sometimes it's very, very connected. And even though, you know, often you don't, they're in dispersed parts of the world, they're connected conceptually, and these are physically connected to one another. Okay.
Liz, I think it's interesting because there's, to me, there's that little tag that you get on the dreaded Facebook that says, what is on your mind. Doesn't ask you, you know, write a caption, says what is on your mind. And it's interesting, the last 2 or 3 lectures that I've heard you give over the last 2 or 3 years, and you see, it's clear that the high line is really still on your mind. The high line is your child, really. The high line is your you know, piece of scoring paper that you can continue to write more on. And it's fascinating because on the other hand, somebody's going to ask you this if I don't, but you're doing a lot of buildings, and you're doing a lot of buildings in other places. The other thing that occurred to me is that it's a conversation very much about New York. When you show the various performers and things that are going there, it's very much talking to New York. It feels very New Yorky. I mean, they may have come from everywhere, but it's interesting that, and yet when one sees you transposed, I've only seen you transposed into Los Angeles, but you know, God willing, you may be transposed into London also. You're fantastically good architects, but maybe you feel, and this is, maybe you feel, yes, we can do that. That's not, I'm not saying you're not interested, but your heart is in this. I almost feel that, you know, you're going to tell Mr. Poots, who runs the shed, you know, can I take it over for a month? I could see you wanting to almost to do his job too. And yes, maybe another building goes up which has some interesting stuff, but I don't know. This is not a criticism, but it does come through loud and clear, particularly here where I know you've got a restricted amount of time this evening, today, lunchtime, but you concentrate on this setting the scene of the scene. And maybe there's some kids out there saying, yeah, but how do they do their building? Which maybe doesn't, you know, you don't need to tell them. But I'm intrigued too, because back to the Facebook, what is on your mind? It is clear that this is on your mind. You know,
that's yeah.
In
I mean,
the
you
way
saw
that perhaps, you know, to run the clock way back, the slow house was on your mind for an extended period and incorporated and anticipated other things. I'm always interested by this because one of the things that this dreaded Zoom, etc., does is to force us to have to concentrate. In a way that sometimes is uncomfortable or sometimes tedious, actually. We can't, you know, because the theatre of the lecture, the theatre that I was referring to when you gave that lecture way back at the Stadelschule, was pure theatre. It was using the room and the fact that it was in Germany and it was a high, echoey, strange room, etc., etc., etc. So now we've got this little terrible ambience. We play a few games. Like Max is playing with, you know, he lives in North London, but he would like maybe to live in Calamolino. I keep the animals up the back because that's a sort of signature, but it's poor things really. And yet, so I would imagine as if this terrible lockdown went on long enough, you could become the queen of the lockdown performance. Not what you've just done, but you could design for it, and probably you would get I could imagine you getting a tremendous amount of satisfaction out of that. And so maybe the way that the escalator moves through the sort of tube in the road is lovely, but it doesn't. You don't talk about it because yes, you've done that. You can go and see it, and you know, nice building conversation.
It's interesting that this format. You know, I haven't yet, you know, but just simply because we're trying to keep our studio moving, that there has been less time for creative, you know, uses of the format. But I do have to say that there's something about flattening space, taking away the third dimension and extending the fourth, which in many ways is not a great thing because Zoom days take 3 times as long as normal days. As you probably know, there's sometimes communication and design very, very difficult in this format. You know, I do think that, you know, again, every opportunity is a manifestation of the work itself. So it's never, you know, like this reflection on this compact site in New York is not so much that our studio is New York centric, but there's a set of things that, you know, that we could see some history happening in front of us that we could also respond to. And that's a very unusual thing. And, you know, in a certain way, we're local architects in New York. You know, we've been able to do so many projects while we're doing work in different parts of the world. And it's as important. And of course, you know, London projects are incredibly important to us, the V&A and the Center for Music. We're also starting a project in Budapest now. We're working in China. We're working in Sydney. And we're trying to finish our project in Rio and in different parts of the world. And I should also acknowledge my partners, Rick Scofidio, who continues to put up with me, and Charles Renfro and Ben Gilmartin. And our studio, which is, I have to say, a bunch of collaborators and misfits that all found themselves together that work collectively on these projects. So it's not just me, we're talking about me, but it's, you know, it's the whole team. But there's, you know, when you say what's on your mind, you know, what's on mind is, I mean, obviously, you know, this moment of pause in the pandemic has allowed us, you know, inadvertently to have a point to slow everything down and to just reflect on things. And when the, you know, when the killing happened, the police brutality in the US, it was a very poignant and focused moment that came out of this ennui of being, you know, stuck in one place for so long, that sort of brought a consciousness, I think, to many people about, you know, bigger issues, and that architecture plays a role in, and a reflection on, you know, what did we do, what have we done, what could we do. And maybe that's also really on my mind. That particular spot in space shows that there's potential agency for the architect to maybe contribute in program making. So we're not only receiving and inheriting old models and paradigms, but maybe changing those. And then also acting critically, but critically and generatively. You know, the opera was, I think, a beautiful experience. Many people got, you know, many people were moved by it. It was a moment in New York where there was a kind of sense of citizenry. And I have to say that you know, that is on my mind too. How can an architect, you know, or how could someone that's in the discipline of architecture, both as an educator, as a designer, but also as a citizen of a city, a country, you know, how could we think about expanding our agency to make change? And not that I have particular answers, but on reflection, you know, our work has been always, you know, questioning the status quo, and you know, maybe you know, going beyond the work that we did just independently to work where we have a seat at the table with policymakers and institution leaders to actually affect some change.
You mentioned the word educator briefly, and I wanted earlier actually wanted to ask you something about coming out of Cooper, because as I remind you, you both came out of Cooper. And at that time, you know, Cooper was a very unusual school. It was a very, and run by a kind of almost a mystic. I feel that John Haydock was, you know, he was a intriguing character and almost a mystic. And he also made pieces of theatre. I mean, he made these strange objects and the books, which are very searching. And I wonder whether that, and I don't presume that Cooper's like that now, but at that period it was. And even though you escaped it, Rick didn't. Rick continued with it. But that's by the way. I wonder if that it was in a way a good grounding for somebody like you, that had you gone to a kind of technical high school type place, or its American equivalent, of which there are hundreds, you would have to have made a different kind of break. That it kind of, and the moment at which I first met you, you still had a back toenail in the protective cocoon of Cooper. You were bursting through it, and of course have done things that Haydock would have never probably dreamed of. But
you're right.
There's some special thread running through.
Absolutely. I think my entree into architecture came from being an art student at Cooper Union, and because I ran into John Haydock someplace, and I saw him, and I heard him, and I was so intrigued because he was so cryptic and poetic, and he was so large physically and entertaining and dramatic and theatrical. I was just, I thought, okay, I'm going to take a course in the architecture school, even though I had no intention of actually studying the field. And I was and in my first course, I was, again, John Haydock made all the difference, because he was, as you say, a kind of mystic, occult figure. He talked in riddles, he never said anything directly. Everything he said, you had to interpret. But it was around architecture as a cultural discipline. And he drew from literature, and he drew from painting, and his sources were really eclectic and super interesting. And he was not really for the profession. It didn't feel like a professional school, even though it was a professional degree. But he opened the doors for lateral thinking and for dissident thinking. And while I was there, and you're kind of right that in a way, I wasn't a victim of the school, but I was a survivor of the school. I took what was the best of it, which was the freedom of thought and exploration, experimentation, and took that in a way that then Rick and that's where I met Rick. And it was a free education, by the way, I should say. And also I should say there was a very tight connection with the AA at the time.
I remember that well.
And Boyarsky. And so there was a kind of network of schools of which the AA and these were almost like sister schools, and many people were exchanged between the faculty and speakers and that were traded between the two. And my first public lecture was at the AA after Alvin Boyarsky gave me a stiff drink because I was so nervous to do it. And then I went out and I sort of hogged the stage. But it was, I think that there was a very, very special alliance in thinking about architecture in an alternative way, in a way that was deeper and thicker than the profession would have allowed at that time.
Well, it certainly operated the other way. Cooper was the place that we looked at.
That's right.
And this thing of the architecture school being a creator of a cultural discipline, I think, is very interesting, because I still feel it should be so. There's a whole lot of interesting people could come out of architecture schools. And sometimes I think that is forgotten. Everybody's needing to be practical at the moment. But
and I would say that
architecture as a cultural discipline is a great notion, and not a flim flam, at all.
Yeah, and I think that there are distinctions and that one could make between the notion of an autonomous discipline, really, that you go into the academy and that you basically focus on disciplinary work, and then you don't look outside of it. And then there's that difference between looking at interdisciplinary work, and then there's the acknowledgement that there's a world out there that keeps moving and that you have to also move with it. to avoid your own obsolescence, in the world. And so, and there are many issues out there. And I would just sort of separate, there's the practical knowledge of that architects need to know, and that can be folded into the education, but that's not all it is. It's all of the other stuff, that awareness of the world, and that opportunity to step across different fields and push the boundaries of one's own discipline that makes it really worthwhile. And that's what schools can instill in students.
I believe that too. Liz, I'm getting secret messages on various machines. You have another possibly 10, 15 minutes, and I guess there's a queue of people out there at this window somewhere who'd like to ask questions. Max, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much for that, Liz. And I think just we have first year students here in the room, and there's one student I'd like, Alfie, could you turn on your screen and could you ask Alfie, because he has a question about performance and choreography, which I think would work quite well, talking about the High Line and talking about the shed and how it activates the city. So Alfie, could you turn your camera on and ask your question, please?
Yeah, hi, can everyone see me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All good, great. Thanks for the talk, it was great. I just wanted to say, yeah, what do you and Peter see as the opportunities for performativity and choreography sort of within urbanism? So kind of with the shed and with Blur building and with a lot of, with the opera happening, it's like, are the buildings actors within the performance of the city, or are they part of the stage, or do you see them as both? And how can that kind of play with the, the ongoing life of the city?
Well, it's a big question. I have to say that every one of our projects imagines the building or the park or whatever it is as as a, how could I say, as a performance in itself. I mean, we could imagine a choreography where we design something where, one comes in here and looks at something there and is drawn to something over there and experiences something, but we could never really predict the way people move. But to imagine that an architecture really comes to life when humans occupy it, and then determine uses, that you can't predict. I mean, that to me is like the most interesting thing is when unexpected things happen, that you could never have choreographed or written into the project. And so, I think that it is, architecture is very four-dimensional. You have to, it doesn't, we have no good system of representation to actually draw and put time into our representations. We could make animations, that's maybe one tool that we have, but it's very difficult to construct in plan and section and, other kinds of still formats, and with time in mind. And I think that's a great challenge to young architects, is to invent a notational system that we could communicate in that takes in, 4D. How do we do that? So that's one a very small partial answer to your question. In terms of the urban, I want to say one thing, and then Peter should respond also. The High Line in and of itself was able to transgress the notion of stoplights. There's a city grid and you have to stop for traffic, every 200 feet. And, when you're on the High Line, you don't have to stop for traffic ever, for a mile and a half. And there's something about being able to hear the pulse of a city, and it does have a pulse and has a tempo, and that drone of sound is the start and stop of cars. And to be able to now live in a world on another elevation where there's a certain kind of freedom away from that is really, really interesting. I also imagine a freedom away from being off of city streets and being able to move laterally through buildings from block to block to block to block, and somehow imagine a whole ground floor that's open up to, a street that goes in every direction, where we're not limited to the movement of cars. which could produce not a specific choreography, but an absence of controlled movement. Peter, maybe you can also take a swipe at that question.
I have a specific memory around the time that you and Rick came to the Stadelschule, the little tiny architecture school. The whole class, I remember, stopped and went down the street to where William Forsythe, who ran the Frankfurt Ballet at that time, was doing the first performance of Artifact, which is probably still his ballet. And I got to know Forsythe to some extent, and he always said that he wanted to be an architect. But one saw over the various, and I said, well, he said, I want to be an architect, didn't have the math. And I noticed Forsythe was in your first week's program when the Shadow.
Yes.
I know that Poots, who we overheard in a restaurant talking about Forsythe, so there's a loop there. But Forsythe then got very interested in Liebskin's drawings. And Forsythe also, in some of his ballets, started to work with space, and then with light, and then with film, and then with heads popping up through the floor and so on. But if guys like that can virtually engage in architecture, but can engage in film, and then I have also thought for a long time, and I have sometimes in certain sort of lecture used pictures of choreographers' diagrams. They are able to deal with the fourth dimension. We can do beautiful drawings as architects, but we're only really dealing with 3 dimensions. They can somehow organize 4 dimensions with an incredibly grotty, scruffy drawing. I've always thought that even the nicest drawings of devices and swings and moves, but these guys are thinking that. And then Forsythe, I'm sure you've met him and seen him operating.
He's a great friend. He's actually a great friend.
Right. Yeah. And he wanders, as you know, around the back of the hall with his headphones on. He's still tuning as the thing is going on. And I think that I mean, he's just one I can think of, but it has this memory of that period when you came and did your choreograph thing. And it probably wasn't more than about 6 weeks away when Forsythe did a thing, and then did a thing where heads popping out of, like ballets do not have things happening out of the floor. And then he did one with singing. And I think there are a few key people out there who change the course of how one thinks. I can remember that not only myself, but the whole class, we would come back, we'd be talking about it for days afterwards, and we'd be refreshed. And often something that's happening in an alongside territory can be more inspiring to you in your territory than looking at another architect who's sort of done a corner rather nicer, kind of thing. It's sort of, okay, they do corners nicer. But something that moves you. So it's back to the loop of the shed being one of your devices, but the shed existing also through characters like him. Then using it, I could imagine, I could imagine that you give him the shed and a decent group of dancers, and he will do something with it that somebody else won't do it. You might have them dangling from the ceiling or moving with the movement of the building. As I said, I've been following Bill's work forever, and he's one of the people that I really look at. In what he did in his practice, in his discipline, understanding classical ballet, and being, coming from there into contemporary and producing a new language. That's very different, and being very sort of demanding of his dancers also that have the technique, but also very, very open to thinking about space and the body in space. And he's always very responsive to space. And I've asked him about the way that he records. And I think, as I remember, he said just videos, that's the best way.
I think maybe before videos were so available, it might have been through another notational system, you know, and we know that many choreographers do use notation, have their own sets. And we're working with Bill T. Jones now, you know, on a project at the Armory, and also here, you know, we're working with the movement, the body, and movement in space in a very large setting that's based on it's a piece about race actually, and it's triggered by a section of in Moby Dick that was a moment of inspiration about this marginal character that becomes like the center of the thinking. But in any case, the relationship I think with choreography is a very natural one with architecture, and we've done a number of dance works, and it has been also not only about the body in space and notational systems. It's also the way that dance could transgress the stage and the conventions of performance, you know, and can it, you know, it can happen anywhere and everywhere. And then you start to break down, you know, certain formal aspects of dance, and then you think about everyday life being choreographed, you know, our ritual movements and so forth. That it starts to become very blurry, and in a beautiful way that there's a very good and natural relationship between those two disciplines, because we're always thinking about moving bodies as architects.
Okay, I know that we're a bit short on time, so thanks very much for that. I'm going to bring in a question from YouTube from Alan Crawford, who asked the question that you mentioned the change of speed that we're experiencing. Do you think that this is accelerating even more quickly now in the coming decade? And how do you think that will have an impact on architecture and architectural education?
Oh yeah, good question. I think that that, you know, in a way, buildings are they naturally resist time, the movement of time, and you know, and when we think back on what makes a building enduring, it's usually, you know, those buildings that are, you know, those classical buildings that have been there forever, you know, that are stone, and but you know, in the end, architecture is geofixed, it's heavy and it's expensive, and our world is moving ever so fast. The moment you understand a problem and you have an architectural solution and you produce something, the reason for its very existence has moved, has changed. So I think the big question for architecture is, in a fast, in a very speedily changing world, and we saw a lot of evidence of how fast it is with the pandemic, you know, that starts in one part of the world and, you know, and it's around the globe. So that's how fast a germ can spread, you know, how fast the racial injustice issue in America has spread around and become a major issue. So society is changing very fast. Sometimes it goes into reverse, unfortunately, but let's just say that, you know, in my opinion, architecture is too slow to respond. And what we can do maybe as architects is to think creatively about flexibility of program and size, that buildings, for them to be worthy of being retained, would be able to change function and be able to change, you know, to become sort of transformers in themselves, but without neutrality, because usually one equates flexibility with a kind of generic thing, like a column grid, you know, boom, 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 repetition. But can architecture be made with distinction and also with flexibility? I think that's kind of where our studio is going and what we're thinking about. And I think that students, you know, could help to budge the, you know, the system a little bit further. You know, you guys are, you know, as the world spins very fast, you're there right now. And students right now have this kind of very strange condition of being, you know, there may be a whole year that one doesn't actually go into a school, into a physical space. I don't know how it is in England, but in the States, there are all sorts of conversations about what happens next semester, whether school will open. So you're in this very unusual situation of being in one space but being everywhere and connected. And I think that we all have to think about how these kinds of events, which ones of them are related to physical space. And I would say something about densification of cities. I believe in densification. The pandemic is not going to change my view of that cities must be dense to be good. But there are certain problems that are solved by medicine. This is a problem that needs to be solved by medicine and not by architecture becoming sparse and by moving to the suburbs. So the short-term problems and long-term problems, and how do we deal with them, and maybe thinking about time in those kinds of durations.
Okay, thank you. There's a question that kind of feeds a little bit on from this, which is there are two questions that are linked to your project, The Shed. And one of them is from Owen, one of our first year students actually, who asks, do you think The Shed as a piece of architecture is open and flexible or actually incredibly specific? And then Barris asked the question about the Shed, quite a specific question, but referring to an interview that you said that The Shed was, the objective was to make it a truly flexible building. And it being inspired by Cedric Price. Like him, you had no idea what art would look like in 10 or 20 years. And we could all predict that it was a space that would still matter. So I guess this question is about the flexibility, and then people are very interested, obviously, in your thinking, which you've touched on slightly about what will happen in terms of adaptability in the current scenario. But that's two questions in one.
Okay. So I'll try to answer them both somehow. When we think about art forms in the future, we know now that many artists are working in collaboration with multiple disciplines. Many are sort of producing their own kind of disciplines, new ways of making things. And so rather than respond to any specific thing right now, a way to think about flexibility is to think about the things that won't change. What won't change? So gravity won't change. There'll still be gravity in 20 years and 50 years. And so anything that's load bearing has to be accounted for. So the building had to be able to take live and heavy loads, even though, next projects might be atmospheric. But that won't change. Another thing that won't change is the price of real estate will change, will keep going up in New York. And so to be able to carve away a space that's devoted for the use of artists and publics for generating these contributions to the culture of our time is really important. But that space, what is that space? It could be large or small. It could be indoors or outdoors. And we're able to control that cube of space that we were able to build in and protect. And so in that way, having a big space and having an extra big space allows us to accommodate very big things. Thomas Saraceno his show will open when it's safe to open in the near future, and it will consume the whole shed. But there are many things that can happen there that are at a large scale. But many artists work small, and that space could be carved up. But we also have many spaces in the shed that are in the base part of the building that could be cut up in a conventional way, like any museum gallery space can. The need for power, for anything that is digital, has a motor or has lighting, that's probably not going to go away for a while. I mean, it can go remote. Maybe we already communicate remotely. So, we know that there's a very important to have the ability to have the building have electrical infrastructure and a lot of potential of the use of, of power. in that building, a lot of capacity. Those are the main things, and I would call that the infrastructure that you see in the physical structure, the steel structure which can hold anything, and the floors which can hold anything, with the electrical infrastructure all throughout and communication infrastructure, and as well as the potential to make large and small space and control its sound and light. So those are the fundamentals, and in that way, I think the shed is very flexible. Its unique characteristic is that it can change its footprint, which it can do, again, with very, very little horsepower, so it doesn't need a lot of electrical sustenance. And what it does from a sustainability standpoint is it doesn't force the curators to have to program that space when they don't need it, you know, and it could be, it doesn't have to be there, so it doesn't have to be heated or cooled or stay empty. And it could be turned over to outdoor events and the public. So in those ways, I think the shed is very, very flexible in some ways that I described in terms of the ability to change shows very, very quickly at a lower cost that it would usually take to do a big load in, you know, and to start a new production and to take it down and disassemble it. So in those ways, it allows more funding to go into the actual work itself.
Okay, that's great. I think we're probably going to have to start to, you know, draw things to a close now. What we always try to do, Peter, yeah, you want to come in?
Well, I would like to, I'm sort of doing my wind-up moment, I guess. From a slightly proprietorial note, I noticed you just passed over the fact that Thomas Saraceno is going to do a show there. And would you believe that in that same audience at the Stadelschule, all those years ago, was a certain Thomas Saraceno who was being an architecture student, and the rest, of course, is history. So I'm rather always amused in this sort of broad catchment of the culture of the world that there are certain figures that crop up, and they crop up again, and they crop up again, and they loop around. And I think that that's nice. And the other proprietorial note, I suppose I can say proprietorial, is that you are to repeat what was said earlier, that you're a Bartlett visiting professor. Now, in the current circumstances, rather than, you know, excited young ladies from Shanghai saying, "Gosh, that's Liz Diller, I just saw her go in the door," they can't. You can come in the door, but I look forward to the time when actually you will be coming in the door. I think I can, on Bob's behalf and everybody else, take that proprietorial. That one isn't really your proprietor, but link, I think, is the important thing. And perhaps if nothing else, these sorts of events make us link. While you were talking, I have to say that I kept seeing little on the screen, there little people asking questions and coming in and going out and whatever the hell they're all doing. There hasn't been time to accommodate all of them. But Max, I think I trust him totally that he's filtered in or filtered out.
Well, we'd just like to say thank you to everyone watching on YouTube. And at this moment, what we usually like to do is just ask everyone to turn on their cameras, those that would like to, in the room, because then it's a bit more like being in a lecture room. You can look at your audience, you can see who's been listening today, and we'd like to thank you greatly for your time and the questions. Whilst we do that, one question from Bob Shiel, our professor and director of school, is a good one to end on, I think, is if the Blur building could be rebuilt as a permanent building, would you approve?
No, absolutely not. No, there are ideas that are temporal and beautiful because they're fleeting, and that project was about you know, a moment in space and time. It was a particular location that we had, and we were able to harness the water as a site, as an atmosphere, as a building material, and it was never meant to be a monument to itself. And we had another opportunity to work with the same materials. We'll probably do something a bit different. But I do, that's why performance is so great. It's fleeting also. You can't, it's not like architecture that it sticks into the ground and is there. And so I think that is something that we should also embrace, those very impermanent things that could happen for a day, an hour, a month. And when I think about our early work, some of it was guerrilla in terms of occupying a site for a day and doing something that was experienced by some people, maybe very few, but it was an opportunity to make something physical as opposed to only do it on paper, and put it on a gallery wall or something like that. It was never enough. So working in space is important, but temporality, I think, is a kind of, it's adjustable, it's expandable, and not everything is meant to always be there. And I do want to take one opportunity before we end to say, Peter is acknowledging these various people that have crossed, that have been through the Städteschule and have followed Peter and his work and his career. And, that there's something that we all have in common, people that we talked about, Thomas and Bill Forsyth, and maybe myself and Rick in our studio, that we're all doing work that is not easily classifiable. We're all working, expanding and pushing the boundaries of our own disciplines and redefining them. And I think that it's not a huge coincidence that we're all always sort of, in Peter's orbit, because he is one of the great references of our studio and my education. I'm just a tiny bit younger than Peter, but when I saw the early work of Archigram and beyond, it was a hope. It was a new way of thinking, and it wasn't only John Haydock that was the influence. It was actually Peter's work that was also a huge influence. So I think that you guys at Bartlett are very privileged to actually be able to also be in Peter's orbit, and for someone that's truly restless in his work and his teaching.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's been watching on YouTube. We've been live on YouTube with Elizabeth Diller in New York. Peter Cook has been hosting the series of Around the World in 8 hours. And this morning we were talking to Sue Fujimoto in Tokyo. The next session is in 2 weeks on Friday the 26th. And we have the rescheduled talk with Wang Xu and Lu Yu Wang, and we also have Janine Gang as well from Chicago joining us. So it's another great session to tune in on. And just before we go, I know Liz has to go, but Peter, would you mind showing us your latest lockdown drawing?
Oh, I will.
Carrots.
Hang on, I've got to. How do I do that? There's so much stuff on the. How do I do that? Oh. Wait a minute. I don't want to turn off Zoom, but I.
Do you have the physical one though, Peter? The one under your.
Oh, I can pick it up from the
Yeah,
floor.
that would be best. Just pick it up and show us.
Pick it up and show
Yes.
So Peter has actually been entertaining all of our students every Friday and showing the wonderful works that he's been making during lockdown.
Yeah. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah.
It will be on Facebook in about 5 minutes. And see it properly.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Peter, can you hold it horizontally?
It's about
yeah,
returning to backyard industry and vertical market gardening.
Fabulous.
And Yale is about to remodel our garden, so we're into gardening this month.
Okay, save me a cauliflower.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you all. Thanks for joining us, and tune in again in the next 2 weeks. So Goodbye, all. Thanks, Liz. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank
For
you.
helping and hosting.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Max.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Matt.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And Michael. Yeah.